The Star Wars galaxy was home to a vast array of intelligent life, from familiar humanoids to aliens of more esoteric body plans and lifestyles. These beings were united, however, by their intelligence and acute self-awareness, which earned them the classification of sentient beings. But if you know anything at all about nature, it's that it rarely works in neat, compartmentalized categories. It more typically works in spectrums, and as such, there are often fringe cases that blur the lines between what humans and other sentients might consider different groups. In the Star Wars galaxy, sentience was no different. There were many species that stood close to the line between intelligent and unintelligent life, making the question of what defines a sentient species difficult. There were also many attempts by powerful and malicious actors to blur the line deliberately, often to cast doubt on the sentience of particular species for their own ends. In this video, we'll be taking a look at a few cases where the line between the sentient and non-sentient was blurred, discussing both evolutionary and legal desentification.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Both in real life and in the Star Wars universe, sentient beings are popularly considered the apex of evolution. But evolution isn't a linear process with set goals. High intelligence and self-awareness are just some of many traits that might randomly develop, and in different environments, they could theoretically be undesirable as an evolutionary trait. In Star Wars, there's even a few examples of sentient species evolving into non-sentient or semi-sentient species, which would be one form of desentification. One particularly significant instance of this was the fate of the ancient Kwa of Dathomir. In ancient times, the Kwa were one of the most advanced and intelligent peoples in the galaxy, building infinity gates that served as portals across the stars and teaching the younger races the ways of the Force. But during their travels, the Kwa made a fatal mistake. They introduced the Rakata to the Force, beginning 10 millennia of terror. The Rakata formed an infinite empire that enslaved the galaxy, and after a brutal war, they conquered the Kwa and utterly destroyed their civilization. The Kwa were all but destroyed, and the remaining descendants slowly evolved into a semi-sentient animal species, the Kui. The reason for this isn't entirely clear, although the Night Sisters believed that this was the spirits of Dathomir getting back at the Kwa for creating wounds in the spirit world with their infinity gates. Regardless, the Kwa became herd animals roaming the planets of Dathomir. They retained echoes of their forebears' intelligence, such as social behaviors, but they lost the ability to speak and most other elements of sentience. A more recent example of evolutionary desentification was the Basiliskans, an advanced and intelligent reptilian species who, for millennia, were prominent members of the Republic. Then, during the Mandalorian Crusades, the Basiliskans were attacked by the Mandalorians, who destroyed their homeworld, wiped out most of their species, and enslaved the few Basiliskans who survived. Their advanced military technology was appropriated by the Mandalorians, while the Basiliskans were subjected to brief lives of misery and menial labor. The Mandalorians treated the Basiliskans like beasts, and over hundreds of years of such treatment, that's exactly what the remaining Basiliskans became. By the new Sith Wars, all that remained of the Basiliskans were what the Mandalorians called Lagatos war dragons, non-sentient creatures that Mandalorian warriors used as mounts. One last group of examples of this phenomenon were the mutants that prowled the deep underlevels of many of the galaxy's city planets, most notably Coruscant. Two of the mutant species of Coruscant, the Coruscanti Ogre and the Chthon, were believed to be descended from humans that had been exposed to industrial pollutants in Galactic City's death, becoming only semi-sentient in the process. Coruscanti Ogres were still able to use rudimentary technology, and a few could even understand basic, but they had almost entirely lost their sentience in most respects. The Chthons, meanwhile, were entirely uncommunicative and usually described as zombie-like. They could use basic technology and work in groups to bring down prey, but they were only semi-sentient, and they strayed further from sentience with each passing generation. This phenomenon of a species losing sentience wasn't common, however. Most species whose sentience was in question had only ever been semi-sentient. Many of these creatures were closer to sentience than other species gave them credit for, but were classified as non-sentient for various reasons. This caused all sorts of questionable ethical situations, in which the line between exterminating an infestation of pets and committing genocide against an intelligent but low-tech species was blurred, often deliberately. One example of a borderline species were the mooches of Abrogado Ray. These little guys were fur-covered lizards that lived in huge underground dens, which thousands of mooches could call home. All the mooches in a den were birthed by a queen, and moocher queens were pretty indisputably intelligent. Non-queen mooches, however, were much less intelligent and classified as semi-sentient. Typically, moochers were reliant on their queen, but occasionally, moocher queens would banish some of their offspring from the den, and these moochers typically found their way to settlements of Abrogado Ray's sentience. Moochers were considered unintelligent pests by the people of Abrogado Ray, but their true level of sentience is unclear. They were at least intelligent enough, however, to be able to panhandle. A similar species that was treated even more horrifically was the runnarts, a species of meter-tall rodents that were originally from Rydar 2. Runnarts were semi-sentient, but they were just shy of legally defined sentience. They lacked complex emotions, but they had language, complex tribal groups, and a considerable degree of intelligence. There's an argument to be made that runnarts should have been classified as sentience, if just barely so, but they were strictly classified as semi-sentient for one simple reason: to facilitate campaigns of genocide against them. Rydar 2, you see, was colonized by humans, and after the runnarts decided that human children made for a tasty snack and started raiding human settlements, the human colonizers set out to exterminate the runnarts entirely, which they were allowed to do thanks to the runnarts' classification as non-sentient. Runnarts were eventually extirpated from Rydar 2, but survivors of the species spread to the neighboring planet Aralia, where they re-established themselves and enjoyed a rapid population boom. But then, during the Imperial era, human populations spread to Aralia as well. When they discovered the runnart colonies on the planet, they hired exterminators to clear out their warrens, only for the runnart tribes to band together and kill the pest control teams. This brought the runnart's semi-sentience into question, but the Aralian colonists were able to lobby the local imperial governor to uphold their designation as semi-sentient, and the colonists were able to continue their campaign of genocide without much scrutiny. These could both arguably be considered examples of legal desentification, the legal denial of a species' sentience, usually for some ulterior motive. A few properly sentient species were also subjected to legal desentification by dishonest actors on a few occasions, misclassified as semi-sentient on purpose to allow them to legally get away with things like genocide and slavery. One example of this was the Mantellian Savrips. These titanic reptiles were native to Ord Mantell, and though they were considered primitive by the standards of outsiders, they had their own rudimentary language, wore clothing, and made use of simple weapons. Nonetheless, their societies were tribal, hunter-gatherer affairs, and so Ord Mantell settlers considered them to just be particularly cunning animals. Like the runnarts, the Mantellian Savrips were classified as semi-sentient, which allowed the settlers to hunt them to near extinction. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk were also subject to legal desentification, and this happened not once, but twice. When Zerka Corporation first came to Kashyyyk and realized that selling Wookiee slaves would make them a fortune, they lobbied the Republic to classify the Wookiees as semi-sentient due to their inability to speak Basic and their so-called primitive lifestyles. This allowed Zerka to transform Kashyyyk into a slave-harvesting world until the Wookiees staged a revolution and drove them away, sometime after which they were officially recognized as sentient. During the Dark Times, however, the Empire tried the same trick again, despite the fact the Wookiees now had a technologically advanced civilization and had become known across the galaxy as sentient. This reclassification was transparently dishonest, but it allowed the Empire to circumvent its own anti-slavery laws and use Wookiees for forced labor, most notably in the construction of the first Death Star. So that's our look at the blurry line between the sentient and the semi-sentient, and the different scenarios that have forced some species over that line, either legally or evolutionary. But what do you think? Do you want to see more videos about any of these species? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.